Welcome to the Planes and Directions tutorial. This is to help you understand your anatomical planes and directions and surface directions as well. The first anatomical plane we're going to talk about is the median or mid-sagittal anatomical plane. Now this plane divides the body into equal left and right halves. So as we can see, we have an animal here who has been divided in the median plane, the mid-sagittal plane. There is an equal right and left half. Now, making sure that you understand, the animal's right half is in my left hand. Okay, so this is the right and this is the left. You always have to be the animal to understand what side of the animal it is. So this is the right half, this is the left half. Median or mid-sagittal. The next anatomical plane we're going to talk about is sagittal. Now sagittal divides the body into left and right parts that are not equal, unequal parts. So here we have an animal who has been divided into a left and right part, and it is unequal. See that clearly the right half is quite smaller than the left half. That is sagittal. Anything that was down the middle would be considered mid-sagittal. So these are not equal, this is just sagittal. A dorsal would divide the body into dorsal and ventral parts. Here we have an animal who has been divided into, we take and we cut the animal into a dorsal part, which is an upper part, and a ventral part, which is a belly part. Dorsal plane, creating an upper half and a lower half of the animal. That is the dorsal. A transverse plane divides the body into cranial and caudal parts. Cranial and caudal. So we take our little kitten here. Oops. Okay. Alright. And this cat is going to be creating a cranial portion and a caudal portion. If we were to lay it on its side, it's still a transverse plane, creating a cranial and a caudal portion. No matter where you make the cut, it's still a transverse plane. We can make a transverse plane further forward or further back. It will still create a cranial part and a caudal part. That goes for the dorsal divisions too. No matter where you cut, it still creates a upper half to the body and a lower half to the body. And the transverse will always create a front half or a cranial and a caudal half. Now if you were to do a transverse section on a limb, we create a distal portion and a proximal portion. So this is the distal portion we cut it in half, and we created distal and proximal, which means towards the body. Distal means away from the body. Now we're going to talk about directional terms. Some directional terms can have the same name as an anatomical plane, but they can also be surface terms. A surface term is describing the surface in which it is on. A directional term talks about the direction in which something is going or pointing. And then an anatomical plane is in reference to where it has been cut. So cranial. The first one is cranial. A. This is pointing in a cranial direction, which means towards the head. It's also reference to if we were on a limb, we would consider the front side of the limb that is proximal to the carpus. These highlighted areas here are the carpus, and these highlighted areas over here, or darkened areas, are the hock or tarsus. Okay? The cranial portion would be the surface here. This would be cranial, and the posterior, or I say the back side or caudal side, would be the back side here of the leg. So this has to do with only areas that are proximal to the carpus or the tarsus. This surface area would be considered cranial, and this surface area back here would be considered caudal. B, caudal, that's a direction towards the tail. So anything, if I was saying that I had a dog with a scrape on its bottom right here, I would say that this scrape is caudal to the letter D right here. It is caudal to the letter D, because if I'm describing it from a point of reference, it is caudal. Just like on a map, if you were to say Duluth is north of Minneapolis, it's the same thing. We're describing, we've got 2 points, and we're describing where it is from. And the more anatomy that you know in an animal, the easier it is to describe directionally where it is. If I say that this scrape is dorsal on the spine, as well as being quite, maybe it's on the midline, maybe it's medial, maybe it's median, okay? Alright, so it is also caudal to the letter D, or caudal to whatever lumbar vertebrae is right here. So, like I said, the more anatomy you know, the easier it'll be to do a description of what you're describing, where this lesion is, okay, or cut or scrape, and you can talk to a doctor over the phone and describe exactly where that is so they can understand that. So those are the terms cranial and caudal. Rostral. Rostrals is a very specific term that we use up only in the head area, and rostrum is the word for nose. Rostrum is anything that is toward the tip of the nose. So anything that's going out towards the tip of the nose. If this is a dog with a longer head, it'd be funner to see that, but we got a brachycephalic dog here, don't we? So anything that points towards the tip of the nose, and is usually only used in the head. So that's a very specific term. You would not use the term rostral anywhere else but here. Dorsal and ventral. Now we created that plane. If we wanted to create a dorsal plane, yes, dorsal would be up, okay, towards the spine, okay, towards the backbone here. So on the surface, this is the dorsal surface. And down here we have a ventral surface. If I'm pointing in a direction up towards the surface of the backbone, the directional term would be it's pointing dorsal. So it has to point up this direction. And to point ventral, you have to point down this direction. So C, to the belly, the ventrum, the dorsum, and the ventrum. The other terminology we use dorsal with is in the limbs. Down here, when we go distal to the carpus or the tarsus, okay, the carpus is the equivalency. If you were to get down on all your fours, you can understand this a little bit better. This is our wrist, this is our carpus, and in our hind, okay, this is our ankle. This is the equivalency of our ankle. These are our tarsus, okay? So when we go distal to these anatomical structures, D and D, you can see here, those are dorsal. And the next picture I have will explain that a little bit better, but we accept that these are the dorsal surface. The front is the dorsal surface on all 4 limbs, and on the hind part of the limb, distal to the carpus, is palmar, and distal to the hock is plantar. And that is going to be explained in the next slide here too. I'll show you. Talking again about the palmar surface. Okay, the ground or back surface of the front limb distal to the carpus. Okay, that's H. And the plantar surface is the ground or back surface, and the rear limb that is distal to the tarsus. So we've already been talking about proximal and distal, which means if you look at A here, anything that is moving towards the body is proximal, anything that is moving away from the body is distal. And usually these are used on appendages, the terms proximal and distal. They're more commonly used in these areas of the body, or a tail, or maybe even ear, something that is flowing away from the body. Okay? Coming back to palmar and plantar, you can see as this dog's laying down, we have a dorsal and a dorsal side, which is the front side of the paw. And you can see how that kind of relates to everything is dorsal, is facing upward towards the backbone. So those are going towards the backbone. That's the easiest way to kind of relate it to why would you ever say that that's dorsal. Well, if they lay down like this, these are considered towards the backbone, right? And palmar side, distal to the carpus, is palmar, the underside, the side that's facing down. And then on the back, hind limb, we call it plantar, because you plant your feet in the ground. Other directional terms that we talk about too are medial and lateral. So if we have an animal, we've got our median plane that's been created. Okay? They're cut into equal right and left halves. So this animal has a median plane. Anything that goes towards the median plane, so it's going in or pointing towards the median plane, is called medial. Oh, I'm losing my ears. Alright, goodbye. Anything that is pointing away from the median plane is lateral. In general, when we talk about an animal, the inside surface of their limbs is medial. The outside surface is lateral. Think of a limb as having 4 sides. This would be considered the dorsal side, the front part. The inside is medial, the outside is lateral, and if it's a front limb, you can say, yep, palmar. Okay? And this would be lateral. We've got dorsal, plantar, and the inside is medial. So in general, you can just think of medial as being inside surfacely. It's inside surface of a limb. And if anything, if a direction is pointing in a direction, it's medial. You're pointing in a medial direction, it's pointing towards the median plane. If it's pointing away from the median plane, it is lateral. Please note that medial and median are not the same word. They are 2 different things. Deep to superficial. Deep means towards the surface, towards the center of the body or body part, and superficial means towards the surface of the body or body part. Here's our cat that we did a transverse section in. I think it's easiest to understand this when you do deep to superficial. This is the surface of the animal's body out here. This is more deep, and this blue dot is more superficial. It is closer to the surface. This is deeper into the center of the body. Okay, so superficial is closer to the surface. Deep is near or closer to the center of the body. There are some terminology in your book that we do not discuss or use rather with animals. These are more for humans. Okay? Anterior and posterior, and superior and inferior. In a human, or a biped as your book calls it, biped meaning 2 feet, ped, think ped, pedestrian, right? Okay, 2 feet. Alright, this refers to anterior and posterior would be the ventral or the belly of the human, and posterior, think about your bottom, right? Dorsal or posterior. And then superior and inferior. Superior is towards the head, inferior is towards the feet or tail base. Okay, we do not use this terminology in animals. So to use this on an animal is not technically correct. Will you come across it sometimes? Yes. So just note that this is a terminology we do not use with animals. So if you mark it on a test superior or inferior, it is not correct. Okay. X-ray positions. We have different X-ray positions that we like to lay animals in, and we also have directions, or recumbency is the term that we put them in. Okay. Right and left lateral. You have to think of yourself as the animal and laying down. This animal is laying on what side of its body? Now be the animal. Lay yourself down, okay? This animal is laying on the right side, okay? The right side, or we call it the lateral side, the right lateral. So again, we talked about the lateral surface being the outside of the animal. So this animal's laying on a right lateral, okay? It is in a right lateral. We can also turn the animal and flip it onto its other side, and it would be laying down on its left side. It would be in left lateral recumbency. And then we have dorsal and ventral as well. So here are X-ray positions in kind of in a row here. This one, this animal is laying on its dorsum, okay, its dorsal side. This is dorsal recumbency. This one is laying again on what side? Laying on its right side, so this animal is in right lateral. And this animal is laying on its belly, so we'd consider this to be ventral recumbency. Okay, let's just quick review our directional terms. Okay, A, you can say it, cranial. B is pointing towards the tail end, which is caudal. C, we're pointing towards the belly area, or this surface is known as the ventral surface. D is pointing towards the backbone, or pointing up. Okay, this is the dorsal surface, or pointing towards the backbone. E, we're pointing towards the nose or the rostrum. So rostral direction is which way it's pointing. Now we get down to the limbs here. We're talking about something that is pointing F, which is pointing towards the body. We call that proximal. And we look at G here, which is pointing away from the body. And G is distal. That's right. Okay. Now we look at these surfaces. These are distal, okay, to the carpus, and distal to the hock or the tarsus. Okay. The front side of all four of these paws is known as the dorsal. The back side is known as, on the front, distal to the carpus, is known as palmar. And in the back, we would consider it distal to the tarsus as plantar. Okay, palm, think about your hands. If you have to be the animal, be the animal. It's the best way to do it, the best way to remember. And another side note that we talked about too, that anything that was proximal to the carpus up here in the limbs, we considered cranial and caudal. Cranial, caudal surfaces. Here we have a map of the dog. We've added in all the anatomical planes as well as cranial and caudal and all the directional terms. Okay? So looking at this, you can understand, alright, putting it all together. You know, if I have a lesion here, I'm in a dorsal plane. I'm also in a caudal direction, so I'm over here. If you're describing this to somebody, this is like a map. You're describing, okay, I'm in Minneapolis, or I'm in Duluth, which would be way up here, okay? So you have to be able to tell people which planes you are in, or even what direction you are going. So in order to get them to the point where you want them to understand where that lesion is that this animal has. So looking at all that, the inside of the dog's surface of the body here and the legs, the inside surface we consider medial, and the outside surfaces we say lateral, If it's in the front of the side of the paw, we call that dorsal, and the back side of the paw we call palmar, and then back here we call it plantar. There can be transverse planes that go through the body or through the limb that create, in the limb they create a proximal and distal. In the body they create cranial and caudal. If you give a dorsal plane, it's going to create an upper half of the body and a lower half of the body. And our special term of rostral would be pointing towards the nose, and caudal we can point away from the nose. You would not use the term cranial up here, okay, because it's pointing towards the nose. And again, to highlight, median and medial are not the same. Okay, those are two different things. So, if we have a map of Minnesota and we turn it upside down, does Duluth turn into being south? No, Duluth will always be north, no matter which way you do it. So looking at this animal, we've taken two anatomical planes. We got anatomical plane A and anatomical plane B. This animal is hanging upside down, but the planes still remain the same, no matter what direction it is. Okay? It's all in relationship to the animal. Alright, if we were to cut this animal in this direction, it might be easier for you to understand it if I moved it like this. So we cut it into a transverse, right, creating a cranial half and a caudal half. If I bring it back, okay, we're creating a plane that creates an upper half of the body and a lower half of the body. So it's still dorsal, and this is still ventral. If I turn it this direction, it might be easier to understand. This is the upper half, so it's dorsal, and this bottom half, that's ventral. So this is a dorsal plane. So B is dorsal, A is transverse. Here's a dog that you recognize again from your homework and all the different kinds of X's. Alright, so just to go over a few of them, this dog has, this is the arrow up here that we talked about, and this is the yellow X on its nose. So the terminology we would say, this X is rostral, isn't it? Is rostral. It's in also, it's midline, I guess you could say. Rostral is the terminology I was looking for on that. Nothing more, nothing special. Okay, it's also probably in a cranial side of the plane. If you were to do a transverse plane, it's cranial. It's also dorsal, right? But mostly it is rostral. Okay, that's the one is the most near rostral. This one here, this white X, is if you were to cut this dog, okay, we've got, it's in a caudal direction, and it is in a dorsal, it's close to the spine up here, so it's in a dorsal plane, right? This one down here is closer to the ventrum, isn't it? So this is in a ventral surface. It's not dorsal, it's ventral, alright? It's probably more lateral. I mean, there's a lot of directions you could use to describe exactly where this is. It's not technically medial, because if it was medial, we wouldn't be able to actually see it. Okay, just because you can see this line right here cutting through the median, that's not. It'd have to be underneath the dog. We wouldn't be able to see it. So this is technically more lateral. It's probably on the side of its chest here. Okay. This here, this X, this black X, is it proximal or is it distal? It is proximal to, actually proximal to the carpus, isn't it? I believe that was one of the questions. Is it which X is proximal to the carpus? If this is the carpus, which one is closer to the body? This is the X that is proximal. Which of these X is medial? Which is on the inside surface? Well, we can only see two inside surfaces of the dog's legs here. So this is green X back here is medial. And it's also distal to the hock as well. This is the hock here, or tarsus, and it's distal. The blue X is actually distal. So the surface that it most likely is on, if it's kind of touching the back side here, you would say this is the plantar surface. Again, to reiterate that even if we turn this animal upside down, the directions still remain the same. This will still always be a dorsal direction. This will be a ventral direction. This is cranial. The G is referring to a rostral direction because it's pointing towards the tip of the nose. This is pointing towards a direction towards the back side of the animal, to the tail end. So that is, what would we call that? Caudal. Yep. And here we are distal to the carpus, so it's still palmar. Distal to the tarsus, plantar. So no matter which way we flip it, still remains the same. Medial and lateral, going over that just a little bit more in depth here. We have a horse, and we're talking about this horse's right ear, right? So if you got to be the horse, the right ear. Okay, we've got the outside of the ear and the inside of the ear. So, which is medial and which is lateral? The outside of the ear is lateral, the inside of the ear is medial. This is more towards the midline, this is further away from the midline. Alright? And that goes for the surfaces inside the legs here too. This A, the surface they're pointing at, this is medial, and this is the lateral side of the leg. Now if we had a direction that was pointing this direction, it's just pointing, I'm pointing in a medial direction. I'm just pointing. I'm not talking about surface or anything, I'm just pointing. That would be medial. If I was pointing the other direction away from the midline, so taking the terminology into account, pointing away from the midline, this would be, which direction? Pointing away would be lateral. Okay, those are just arrows pointing. But if I'm literally talking about the surface, okay, which A is pointing to the surface, if I had an owie right there, okay, it's pointing to that surface, we would call that medial. And B is pointing to the surface over here, and we'd call that lateral. Now we're looking at our dog's behind over here. Okay, the tail, which is, we're talking about proximal and distal here. If we're describing A, the tip of the tail, is this proximal or distal? It is further away from the body. It's moving away from the body. This is distal. And moving towards the body, or the base of the tail, that would be proximal. A lot of these arrows, again, we're just going to talk about directional terms. You saw some of these on your cats in your homework, so I'll try to make these a little bit darker and bigger for you to see. We have an arrow that is pointing towards the body, number 5 here. If it's pointing towards the body, we're moving in a proximal. For pointing away, this is distal. If we're pointing away from the midline, is pointing laterally. Pointing towards the midline is medial. Now if I were to use them as surface terms and not directional terms, talking surface, I would say that this point right here is medial, and this point right here is lateral. Directional terms again, this point right there would be proximal, and this point down here would be distal. So now, using your terminology and your directional terms, you should be able to understand that even though the arrow is up here and pointing this direction, it's still pointing in a caudal direction. Okay? This one is still pointing in a cranial direction, even though it's way back here. It's still pointing towards the head. So using the point and looking at the animal, those are your two references, you should be able to say, yep, this is pointing caudal, this one's pointing cranial. And looking at these are planes. What plane would you consider these? If it's a plane that's cutting the animal into a cranial half and a caudal half, that's a transverse. And you've got a plane here that's giving you an upper half and a lower half, or dorsal and a ventral. So this is a dorsal plane. Alright, got the direction pointing towards the tip of the nose. Rostral. Something that's pointing towards the belly. It's ventral. Something that's pointing towards the backbone. Dorsal. Okay, and you can tell 13 and 17 down here, these guys right here, they're actually what surfaces of this cat's feet. This is the palmar, this is the plantar, and they're distal to those carpus and the hock. And the front side of those paws would be dorsal. If we are proximal to the carpus, or up here in this part of the cat, we know these terms to be cranial and caudal surfaces. Cranial surface, caudal surface. Now you can repeat the same things. There's more activities. You can repeat those with these pictures too, if you can see the numbers. If I was describing where 6, or this dot, is to this dot, I would have to say that this dot is more cranial than that dot, isn't it? It's more towards the head. This one is more caudal. If I was saying in reference to the 8, I would say this dot is cranial to the 8, and this dot is caudal to the 8. So you have to have a reference. You can always pick a spot and say, well, you know what, this is more cranial, this is more caudal. This is also more ventral to the backbone, or it's ventral to number 4 up here. So as long as you have a reference and a point, you can describe where it is in relationship to everything else using your anatomical terms. So we saw our puppy kind of describing what kind of, being the dog. If you got an ear over here, what ear is this? Is this the right ear or the left ear? So be the dog. This is the right ear. Okay, this is the dog's right eye. This isn't the greatest picture. On top it looks like you're going for a plane. You're trying to divide this thing into a plane, an anatomical plane, and up top it's not very even, is it? It is. If you get down here, then it becomes more even into a right and left half. So it becomes more of a mid-sagittal. As you get up here, it looks more sagittal plane, doesn't it? This one is truly a sagittal plane over here. If we're looking at it, this is truly a sagittal plane. It is not mid-sagittal or median at all. And if we're cutting the dog in half this way, it's sitting, even though it's sitting, okay, if you were to sit that dog up, okay, you got to be the dog. So the dog is sitting, so even though it's going to be cutting it this direction, you got to think in terms of 3-dimension. What cut is that? That's actually a dorsal cut, isn't it? It's creating an upper half and a lower half to the body. So that's an interesting one, because it's kind of difficult to see because the animal is truly, it's sitting down, but if you were to create that, it would be a dorsal, because it creates an upper half and a lower half, a dorsal half and a ventral half. Alright, here again we've got our animal. Depending on its position, the directions still don't change. It's always the same. Okay, this animal still, this is still dorsal no matter what down here. This is still its ventral, even though it's laying on its back. This is still rostral, going that direction. Laying on its right side, we know that this ear right here is its left ear. Okay, and it's in right lateral recumbency. Alright, this arrow is pointing that direction. If it's pointing towards the head, it's cranial direction. If it's pointing towards the tail, it's in a caudal direction. If it's pointing towards the backbone, it's dorsal. Pointing towards the ventrum, still ventral, even though it's laying on its side. And then you can talk about the relationship of the numbers to each other if you want to. 5 is cranial to the number 6 and the number 8. The number 6 is cranial to the number 8. Number 8 is more caudal to the number 6. Alright? The number 7 is actually more ventral to the number 6. So using your terminology, you can talk about these different things. This animal is laying down too doesn't change the surface terminology either. This is still the bottom of the paw on the right front foot, which is known as the palmar surface, and this is the bottom of the paw on the hind, distal to the hock or the tarsus, which is plantar. Alright, well, I hope that helped, and hope you guys are having a good vacation.